Hey guys, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another wonderful vid. This one I am going to be kind of continuing the series of videos I've been doing on, rock and heavy metal music. Basically, in this one, since you've read the title, I'm kind of asking the question is, how did, these music forms get to the current state that they're in? Basically, uh, where were they, relatively recently, and how did, they kind of morph into where they're currently at? So let's start off by talking about rock and roll, because I think that's a little more complex, and then we'll cover metal separately here shortly. Um, Really, the last, I think, really all-encompassing gigantic movement that rock and roll really had was coincidentally back in the 90s, right? When of course bands like when the Seattle sound exploded, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, etc., etc., etc. Then of course you had bands like Nine Inch Nails, um, you know, Red Hot Chili Peppers, just all sorts of bands exploded onto the scene in the early 90s and just made a tremendous impact. And then shortly after that, what you had really was, you know, second generation rip off, watered down grunge. After kind of the first, you had bands like Puddle of Mud, Stained, all bands of that ilk that were, frankly, a lot. Maybe there was some talent in there, but they were a lot, for lack of a better term, less good than, of course, the originators of the style. And then eventually you got even more watered down stuff like Nickelback and et cetera, to where that style of music just became, honestly, extremely boring. And, and I think the issue is what happened after that was, you know, by the time Nickelback and bands of that ilk were fairly popular, the internet had basically exploded in popularity and had really allowed people to just seek out their niche interests, right? So instead of having one gigantic musical movement that kind of everybody was aware of, you had hundreds or thousands of smaller movements that niche communities were familiar with and kind of latched onto that. And that's kind of where, in my opinion, rock has been ever since. At least, in the mainstream, it's not doing super well. I mean, again, what passes for rock in the mainstream nowadays is mostly, in my opinion, not good. It's either, incredibly electronic influenced or it's rehash of older stuff. I mean, yes, there are a few bright spots, as I have always said, but for the most part, in the mainstream, rock is not innovating, not really the best, it's not really quote where it's at. So that's kind of how I think rock got there. I mean, it just really boiled down to really talented rock musicians not being promoted enough in the internet age. So that's how I think rock got where it is, and what. So that's how we got where we are with rock. As far as how we got where we are with metal, of course, I think metal is in a healthier place than rock because metal has never been as popular as rock, but we'll retaste the steps of metal. Of course, in the 80s, it was, had its giant moment in the sun, right? And then in the 90s, as, grunge kind of took over and alternative rock, metal declined in popularity severely, right? But during that time, even in the 90s, there was still, in my opinion, an absolute explosion of talent in metal in the underground. I mean, I could name hundreds of bands that were, extremely good during this time period. So I don't think it was really that dark. I mean, a lot of people say the 90s were a dark time for metal, but I really don't agree with that. There was so much great stuff going on that I think you know, it was an awesome time for metal. And I think the reason it was so good is because, again, metal is not as big as rock, had never been as big as rock. So the niche nature of the internet that let people seek stuff out actually grew, I think, the metal audience by a fair amount. I know that I personally became aware of many, many, many bands that I had not been aware of before, thanks to the internet. So, and that kind of really just carries over into the present day. Metal, I think, is still in a pretty good place because largely bands that are talented in one way or another are able to promote themselves through the internet and find an audience that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to find. I'm constantly discovering new bands due to the internet. So that is, I think, kind of the main difference between rock and metal. Rock was always designed to be, you know, a bigger mass market phenomenon, and the internet has splintered things so much that that's just not really generally a thing that happens very much anymore, because everything is niche. And metal has always been niche, so I think metal is doing better. I think it's really that simple. As far as what do I think the future holds, I think metal will probably continue on its current trajectory, remain popular with the fans of the genre, and I think new bands will continue to appear and proliferate and, you know, make their mark on the genre. As far as rock goes, I've said this many times before. Do I think it will ever go to what it once was and totally dominate popular music? Who knows? I don't know if it will or not. 50-50 on it. It's a little shaky. Or will just, you know, become music for old people, because, you know, I made a video about how just maybe mainly older people like it. Hard to say what the future holds. I would only be guessing at this point. So anyway, that is it for this. As always, if you like this, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. Share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.